Hello, and I'd like to welcome you all to the book club. My name is Laura Walsh, and I'm the programs manager here at the Trauma Research Foundation. This is our final meeting discussing Bessel Vanderholk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. TRF has had an overwhelming response from our community to this book club, with over 6,300 people enrolled and hundreds participating in the meetings. Tonight, we are super excited to welcome author Bessel Vanderholk. We are all eager to hear what he has to share with us, and very grateful to him for taking the time to be with us. We're going to be structuring the meeting a little differently than past weeks in order to make the most of our time with Bessel. We will be using a Q&A format with questions that our team and panelists have curated from the past 5 weeks. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the past and present panelists who have been a vital part of this book club, as well as all who have engaged on YouTube Live. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our volunteer facilitators, Whitney and Brendan O'Hara. They have done such a fabulous job moderating these meetings. Before I hand the meeting over to them, I just want to share a little bit about each of them with you. And we're not going to spend time on bios tonight, except for I just want to share these 2 bios that haven't been shared yet about Whitney and Brendan. So Whitney earned a Bachelor of Science in Behavioral Science at Utah Valley University and a Master of Social Work at the University of Utah. Her focus areas of study were trauma, human trafficking, and global issues. Whitney is currently the Director of Programs with Aftercare International, whose mission is to protect children and youth from trafficking and exploitation. She has worked to combat child trafficking and exploitation for the last 7 years. Whitney is also a crisis clinician at Huntsman Medical Health Institute. She believes that healing takes place best within the safety of healthy and loving relationships, families, and communities. Brendan is an athlete who completes fitness challenges to raise awareness for PTSD-related causes. He is also a graphic designer, photographer, and writer, running his own business, catering to sports, technology, and consumer retail industries, and PTS-related organizations like the Trauma Research Foundation, having contributed an article to the TRF blog. Brendan recently completed the Chad 1000X Fitness Challenge, raising thousands of dollars for TRF and the Navy SEAL Foundation, and is an outspoken advocate for PTSD treatments like internal family systems in EMDR. Brendan earned a Bachelor of Science in Marketing from Virginia Tech and an advanced certificate in graphic design from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. So I just want to hand the meeting over to them and give Brendan and Whitney just to share a moment or two about the impact that The Body Keeps the Score has had on them personally. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And it's been so great to be here with everyone. And I just want to thank the TRF team for putting this together. They have been so fantastic and dedicated to creating this wonderful space. And Amanda Priest, who created the study guide, did so well with that. And just want to say thank you to her, and also just so appreciative to this book and bringing us all together in this way. And all the panelists and book club members, I've felt so enriched and so hopeful throughout this whole 6-week session, and have learned so much from all of you. And so I'm just so grateful to be here. And this book, I mean, I think I've mentioned it's probably kind of embarrassing how many times I've read it. And each time you just gain so much more, because it's so dense and it has so much good content in it. And I'm just very grateful for what it has brought forward, and this community that it's creating, where we can share and learn from each other. So,
and I'd love to thank TRF for the opportunity to be on this panel as a moderator. It's just meant so much to me, as has this book. And if it weren't for this book, I wouldn't have had access to the treatments that I do have, which finally feel like I'm making progress on my PTSD symptoms that I've been battling for years. And after months of treatments and the opportunity to interact with a trauma-informed space like this and create connections with compassionate people and like-minded people, it's just been a life-changing experience. So just want to thank TRF and all the panelists and Dr. Vanderkolk and everybody else tuning in. So just to go through some guidelines and expectations, please be gracious with differing opinions, and please take space and leave space for others. Panelists, just a reminder to please, you will be called on to spotlight, we will call on each panelist individually to spotlight you for the question that has been curated for you to ask. And whether you're a panelist speaking or a book club member communicating in the YouTube live chat, please remain on topic.
All right, and this is, we'd like to review wellness recommendations. Some of the content that we might be discussing might be triggering. So please feel free to take a pause if needed and take care of yourself. And things you can do, some suggested things are just to maybe get a drink of water, stretch, or do deep breathing. Naming your senses is another thing. What you can see, hear, feel, and touch kind of helps you ground and come back to yourself. So please, yeah, take care of yourself. Okay, and the first question is, will be read by Wendy Tuck.
Thank you, Dr. Vanderkolk. And my question is, what is the significance of shame on trauma?
Well, shame is a very integral part of trauma, particularly childhood trauma, because when you're very young, you are the center of the universe. There's, you have no perspective how other people are thinking, what other people are doing. And so when you're a child, you think that everything that happens because of you. You're magical thinking. It's a little bit the way that when at my age, I go to the Boston Red Sox and the Red Sox lose their game, I always think, oh, the Red Sox lost because I'm at the game. Like, it's just a little remnant of that egocentric thinking. Children are completely egocentric. So if a kid is adored and cherished, a kid says, I'm a wonderful child. If terrible things happen to you, you cannot help but think, I must be a terrible child. So this feeling of being unacceptable, damaged, bad is inevitably a legacy of trauma. And it's also in some ways, paradoxically, a useful thing, because you'd say to yourself, I was at fault here, and you start thinking, what else can I do to make things different? It was some interesting research that shows that people who blame themselves after a trauma do better than people who don't blame themselves after a trauma. Because if you don't blame yourself, you just say, I had nothing to do with it, it just happens, and you lose your sense of agency. But if you say, I could have done something differently, then maybe you can sort of still move to make things different for you in the process. But in the long term, it becomes a very big, hurtful issue that you really feel fundamentally damaged. You feel like you're at fault, that you make bad things happen to you. And this is completely not a cognitive issue. Telling people it wasn't your fault, while it's important to say that, they won't really believe you. Deep down, they will think that it is their fault. And I find that the methods, IFS, psychedelic therapies, sometimes EMDR, where you can really go very deep in your own experience as an adult, can make you go back and say, oh, let's see what happened to this child, that poor child who had to endure this. And so as long as what you call an IFS, you're blended with your abuse, I say, I'm an abused person, you carry that burden of the trauma with you. The moment that you can sort of separate yourself out and say, I'm an adult who as a child was abused, and really visit that child from the adult point of view, you can really say, look what that kid had to put up with. Look, that kid was 3 years old, the kid was 5 years old, that kid didn't do anything. And you, by going very deep inside of yourself, we saw this particularly prominently in our last psychedelic research, you can go like, oh, that poor kid, that kid didn't deserve it. That kid was too young, that kid should have been protected. And so as long as you're completely identified with that traumatized kid who you carry inside of you, you are compelled by shame. But once you are able to say, oh, that's what it was like to be a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old, and this little 6-year-old, 3-year-old did whatever it could, and it didn't get the help it needed, you begin to get away from the shame issue. But I don't think you can get away with it without actually visiting what happened to you. Just saying, you're a beautiful person and God loves you, doesn't go in. You need to really experience what you went through back then and go like, oh, that poor child. That child didn't have a chance. And then you can really sort of have compassion for yourself instead of shame. It's a very important issue.
Okay. Moving on to question number 2, Annie McRae.
Hi, Dr. Vanderkolk. I'm an RN on the front lines. What should all frontline workers understand about trauma for those they serve and for themselves?
Well, there's an interesting, complex question. First thing that comes to mind is that everybody, to a large degree, does the best they can. People don't start off with bad intentions, and if a kid loses control, and if people shut down and they become disruptive, that means that they're getting stirred up by something that they have no control over. And when it happens, you need to have an adult who can help you to calm yourself down, to feel safe, and who really instills a sense of safety in you. I say, come and sit on my lap, or why don't you play with this dog for a little while, or look at people and talk to them and using their name. It's really important to understand that many of the things you see as misbehavior are in fact behaviors that are triggered, where you feel threatened, you feel that danger is going to happen to you, and these behaviors are the result of a perception that you're in danger. And so diagnoses like oppositional defiant disorder are crazy diagnosis. It just means you are a pain in the ass kid. How do you get to be a pain in the ass kid? Because you don't trust anybody. You think that people are going to hurt you all the time. So it's really important to know that the kids do the best they can, but they fall apart because the parts of their brain have to do with danger and extreme fear get activated, and they lose their cognitive capacities. The thing at that point is not to be reasonable, because the reasonable part of the brain is gone. The issue is to create an atmosphere where you feel safe. Sometimes they feel safe by being held. Sometimes they feel safe by being talked to in a very kind way. Sometimes they feel safe by being with a dog or with somebody who just helps them become physiologically calm. So the issue is that to really understand that people are not doing this stuff to hurt you or to upset you. They're really doing this because they don't know anything else, and they're repeating part of their trauma. The other thing for yourself, of course, is being faced with all this misery and this unhappiness is a heavy burden. Working for Child Protective Services is a hard job because you see so much misery and unhappiness and things that you don't feel right. So it's very important for you yourself to establish something in your life that is a sanctuary. For some people, it's their church or their synagogue or their mosque or your yoga studio or your retreat center or your favorite grandma. You need to have a place where you can feel safe. But for me personally, has been very important is to get body work done. Because when you get exposed to trauma, and your body gets stirred up to have these stress responses. And basically, the way we start off in life is when you're a little baby and you're upset. Hopefully, there's somebody who lifts you up and holds you and pats you and lends you their physiological presence to help you to calm yourself down. That's what parenting is all about. And even as adults, sometimes we need to be touched, we need to be held. This morning I was talking to some people about the hammam in Istanbul, where some big person holds you, slaps you around, or warm thing, and you feel that somebody's taking care of your body. So it's very important for us who do this work to have a way of help to resetting our own physiology and a way to say, when I do that, I feel good about myself. When I go climb a mountain or ride my bike or play tennis or sing or pray or make music, and that reinstalls a sense of safety inside of myself. And so I don't think we can really help other people unless we really have done our work to be able to calm ourselves down, to regain a sense of safety. And once you are able to do it for yourself, other people will be able to see that and say, oh, I'd like to become more like that person, because even when things get very scary, they seem to be calm and they seem to know what they're doing. And so our presence is terribly important. So as a young frontline worker, you may think, I don't know very much, and I'm not very well educated, and I'm just a temporary person here, so there's not much I can do. That is so not true. That every interaction that somebody has with somebody else has the potential of instilling a sense of potential, a sense of safety. And kids who have, I did a survey of this week, I'm teaching somewhere, and I asked people who remembers a teacher who saw them as a special person. And almost everybody in the room said, yeah, I remember a teacher, or I remember my aunt, or I remember somebody. And those people stick inside of you. And you want to try to be that person. And don't underestimate the power you have to both help people, but also to hurt people. If you call somebody a name, they will remember that. And that will confirm to them what a damaged and terrible people they are. And then you may say, I'm just a temporary person here, I'm not so important. No, you are very important.
Thank you. Okay, Sarah Fisher for question 3.
Yes, thank you so much. Much respect to you, Dr. Vanderkolk. The question for you is, what are the most vital things we can practice to come back to ourselves when we have a loss of self in mind and body?
That's a very good question. And that's different for different people and depends to some degree on the cultural background you have. So if you grew up in a culture where there's a lot of singing and dancing, singing and dancing would be a great thing to re-establish a sense of agency in your body. These are very bodily things. So being held can, not always, be very helpful to regain a sense of I'm here. Your sense of self is a sense of bodily self. Our language says this, I am somebody, I am nobody. And when you're nobody, you have no body. And when you're somebody, you're a person with a body. So the great issue is, how do I get a sense of agency in my body? And it can be as simple as going bowling, or playing tennis, or doing yoga, or martial arts, or tango dancing, or capoeira, anything that helps you to know, I am here, I feel myself, I need to feel the mass of my body in order to counteract the mass of other bodies and to integrate with other bodies. That's really the core of where a sense of self comes from. So that's a very important part. The other piece is our natural system is that when you feel upset is to make contact with somebody else. And the experience of abuse and neglect is that when you get upset, you reach out for people and there's nobody there. And so whatever you do, you're nobody. Nobody reacts to you and is attuned to your needs, etc. So sitting with somebody and knowing their name and talking to them and saying, let's get up together, or let's sing together, or let's move together, but really knowing somebody and being very attuned to a particular person is very important. I see something happening right now in our culture, very much related to everything, but particularly with the pandemic, is there's more and more apps to calm yourself down. And some of these apps may be quite helpful, but the core way in which we feel like we're somebody is if somebody else is a somebody with us. We are basically relational people, and our mental health system is more and more like, oh, let's give them an app, give them a little protocol. But at the core, we are mammals. And mammals need each other, need to see each other, need to know each other, they need to be known, they need to feel their impact on other people's impact on themselves. And that's not necessarily therapy. I think that choir conductors and music teachers and basketball teachers can be as useful to help you to get a sense of embodiment and being there as any therapist can do. Therapists are always a little dangerous because they like to talk about how bad you feel. And they're not very good in helping people to feel really good by doing things that make your body feel good. But it's a difficult, and the other thing is also very important is, I don't know how much you guys have talked about neurofeedback, but certainly we've talked about all these brain abnormalities and things, different parts of the brain not talking to each other, and neurofeedback can be extraordinarily helpful to people to really gain a sense of agency in your body and being able to concentrate. And part of what the TRF is actually trying to do these days is to create an opportunity for people to learn neurofeedback. My dream is to have, my big dream actually is to have in every school in America from K to 12, kids learn the 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and self-regulation. And that's from age 4 till age 18. Every year you learn more about how can I calm myself down, how can I get a sense of agency, and to explore that in the classroom. And what does singing do for me? What does boxing do for me? What does dancing do for me? What does breathing do for me? What do yoga poses do for me? That should be part of every education. Because if you don't know about yourself, how can you really be a functioning person out there? So very important that we have curricula where kids are really known, are met, and kids in every school do things that make them feel alive. And here I'm always very struck by how unequal our society is. Like I went in the Netherlands as a kid, I went to a school and we had goats and we had chickens and we worked in the garden and we sang and we did a lot of music together. And it's part of how I grew up. My kids went through similar schools like that in Boston because we are privileged people. But if you're a poor person and you go to a public school, the first thing that these guys who don't know what they're talking about do is they abolish recess. They abolish athletic programs, they abolish singing programs, they abolish theater programs, all of the programs that make people feel good about themselves. And then they say, oh, this kid is not learning, let's give them more of a test. No, this kid is not learning because their bodies are frozen in terror and they will not learn until they feel calm. And once they're calm, you don't need to push kids because safe kids are curious. They will learn stuff because they love to learn. But if you're scared, you become defensive and you don't do anything. So it's very important that throughout growing up and beyond, that people really have an opportunity to really practice what it's like to be in sync with other people through athletics, dance, theater, music, as you feel like you're part of a larger group of people and that your body counts.
Thank you. Question 4, Terry Freiberg.
My friend Terry. Hi, Terry.
Terry, you're still on mute.
There we go. Hi, Bess.
Hi.
Well, I was fascinated by your discussion of the limbic system, and especially its role in sensory memories, including traumatic memories. We see that the limbic system is reliant on, sort of created by, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the cingulate gyrus, and of course the parietal lobes. Is this logically similar to saying we humans, in some senses, don't really have a leg, we have a leg system? It's made up of the toes, the foot, the ankle, the calf, the knee, and so on. To what extent have our efforts to localize brain function shown that the plasticity of the brain, including its creativity in cobbling together the limbic system, is more the story than pure and simple localization?
Boy, I wish you would be the keynote speaker at the next American Psychiatric Association meeting to ask that question of people, because it's a very important question. And of course, to some degree, it's a function of very primitive technology. Our brain measuring instruments, of course, are immensely complex and sophisticated, but we are still in our infancy of beginning to identify particular brain areas that have something to do with overall mental functioning. And as you point out, that we are just figuring out how the knee bone moves and how the tibia is connected with the fibula. And that's indeed precisely such a great question. That's the stage that we're at, or were until quite recently. If you come to this year's annual Boston Trauma Conference, the opening speaker will be Marty Teicher, who's done more work on this. And Marty Teicher and later speakers, Huslanius, will talk more and more about brain network. How does the system work together to make things? And so the current state of the art and science is more what networks get activated to make you move. So we're really talking about 3 different networks that all get very damaged by trauma. One is the network of when you don't move. What happens when you are not engaged in anything? It's called the default mode network, very damaged by trauma. Then the salience network, the network in your brain of all these things talking to each other that are able to detect that's important and that's irrelevant. Goes very wrong when you're traumatized. All kind of minor little things where everybody else goes like, what do you get so upset about? It's just somebody didn't say good morning to you. There's no reason to want to kill them, you know. But when your salience network is off, very minor things get labeled as being dangerous, and very dangerous things may get ignored. And so your whole filtering system is off. And our job, and we're not there at this point yet, is to see how we can change that network that allow us to have a more accurate filtering system to be able to say that's relevant and it isn't. And then the third network that people are very much into is the executive network. How do people make decisions about how to do things and to carry a task out to its completion? And how do you use all these different brain systems to play with each other, just like your leg does when you go running, to make you be able to be a runner. And you're absolutely right, these little individual pieces of the brain are just little parts of a much larger whole. And what's also important, and you'll hear that from Marty at the conference, is that when you're a traumatized person, your brain becomes very abnormal. But what's interesting is that the brain abnormalities do not predict how impaired you are, because people also have amazing capacities to compensate and to adapt themselves to very difficult situations. So when you look at the brain of a person with very bad trauma histories, and we do quantitative EEGs on them, objectively you say, this person must be completely off the wall and unable to function. And in fact, many of them are able to function because human beings are very resilient, basically, and are able to work with that damaged brain to still carve out a pretty good life for themselves. So that's sort of at the edge where we are right now. And Marty Teicher and Huslanius are really the two people in the world who I know who know that thing best. But this is a very important question. How do people coordinate these things to make mental systems functional? And we're not there. Like yesterday was an article in New York Times about the psychiatrist of America, the former head of the National Institute of Health, and he said, oh, neuroscience has not quite made it into clinical systems yet, but if we find the right chemicals, we can understand anything. No, you're symbolic creatures. You need your mother. You don't only need chemicals. You need friends. You don't only need SSRIs. You need connections. You need rhythmicity. So scientists oftentimes like to simplify things. Oh, this little chemical explains everything. No, that chemical doesn't explain everything. That was really the fallacy that has really sort of pushed psychiatry to a large degree off the rails and has made psychiatry in the past 3 decades or so increasingly a potentially dangerous profession, to think, oh, if you just take the right drug, you'll be fine. No, that's not how people are wired. We need each other. We need to be in sync with each other. We need to see each other. We need to know each other. We need to know ourselves. And that cannot be reduced to simple brain structures or simple chemicals? Great question. Lousy answer.
All right, question 5 is for Susan Cook.
Thank you for your work. How do we help someone recover from trauma when reconnecting with the body after years of abuse makes them dissociate? For example, child sex trafficking survivors who have been through years and years of repeated and daily abuse. Thank you.
Great question. Recovery from trauma is getting back in touch with your body. So there's this mistaken notion that trauma is about a thing that happened at some point in your life. That's a misunderstanding about trauma, because that event is actually over. It's the past. It's gone. The only thing that really matters is the degree to which that past stuff continues to be alive in your body. And so a lot of people learn that if I shut down my connection with my body, I will not feel all that heartache and all these gut-wrenching feelings, and I'll go through life as a zombie. And if you go through life as a zombie, you have no life, because nothing comes in that gives you pleasure and connection and safety. And so the challenge is, how do you regain a body? That is the recovery from trauma. And actually, so Alicia Skye, who happens to be the CEO of the Trauma Research Foundation, and other people who have been on our panels here are actually experts in doing that, as is Pat Ogden and Peter Levine and many people, is how do you help people to get back in their bodies? And people will say, I don't want to go there. I don't want to breathe. I don't want to do yoga. And so you need to seduce them very carefully. So what Alicia does, for example, she starts with tuning forks. And she just says, what does it feel like to put a tuning fork on your arm? Do you feel the vibration? And you really open up people very gently to allow themselves to have sensations in their bodies. That is the trauma treatment. It's not the story about what happened a long time ago, but the residue of what happened a long time ago and how it lives on in your body today. To my mind, all good trauma treatment is done in the here and now, because that's what trauma is. It's still here, even though the event is over. And so this is what you need to do. And there's still this mistaken notion in many clinicians. So let's talk about your trauma. Let's talk about that. No, that's not what trauma treatment is. It's about having a body that can allow itself to feel what it feels, so it can explore what makes them feel safe and what gives them pleasure and how they can negotiate their lives. That is trauma treatment. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Great question.
Question 6, Janine McConaughey. And it looks like Janine wasn't able to make it on the call, so I'll ask this question. In what ways are the brains of children with ADHD and the brains of trauma survivors alike? How might you use this to help someone understand why trauma impacts them in the ways it does?
Well, very good question. And let's start off with ADHD and psychiatric diagnosis. I insisted on being labeled as an MD because when you're an MD, you learn how to make diagnosis. If somebody has chest pain, you need to find out what is causing the chest pain. And you don't just say that somebody has a chest pain disorder. You need to really go deeper and see what is causing this chest pain. Is it the arterial perfusion? Is it muscular issues? Or is it a viral thing going on? We need to be really precise. Psychiatric diagnoses are none of that. So, I was really part of the DSM-3 and DSM-4, and I helped to create some diagnoses. And basically, it was just a bunch of people sitting in a room saying, oh, let's put these particular symptoms together because they oftentimes go together, and let's call it a diagnosis. They're not diagnoses, just they're a list of symptoms. And these lists of symptoms overlap among very many different conditions, For example, if you get traumatized as a kid, you have a hard time paying attention to concentrate. That's part of the legacy of trauma. When you're always frightened and don't know where the next injury will come from, you become hyper alert and hyper react and blow up, and you can't sit still, you can't concentrate because you don't feel safe in your body. And so if you don't know anything about trauma, you'll say this kid has ADHD. I would say that the vast majority of kids we have ever treated at the trauma center meet criteria for ADHD. They also meet criteria for the other bullshit diagnosis, oppositional defiant disorder, which means you're a pain in the ass. That's all it means. Or conduct disorder. I can't stand the way this kid behaves. Those are not diagnoses. I don't see how psychiatrists can stand up and feel good about themselves as long as you have a diagnostic system that doesn't make any sense. It's all surface phenomena. And so when kids are traumatized, they misbehave and they can't concentrate and all those sort of things. That doesn't mean they have ADHD. That means that they have brains that cannot pay attention and minds that don't feel safe. And so how do we help these kids to feel safe and to feel calm? But as far as I'm concerned, throw out your DSM-5 as far as you can, because it really is not at all a scientific instrument, and it actually gets people away from carefully assessing what is going on with this person and what does this person need to get back on track. And I think most psychiatric diagnoses are really like distractions from that. I know the history of that very well because I was very active early on in the creation of DSM-3 and something before that called the Research Diagnostic Criteria. And so historically, how these diagnoses came into being is that in the 1980s, 1970s, we discovered brain chemicals. And we thought that if we can understand brain chemistry, we'll understand mental illness. And if we find the right drug, then everybody will live happily after. And so it's a very optimistic moment in people's life when we finally discovered about brain chemistry and the promise of brain chemistry. In order to test that, we need to sort of have a little system where we more or less could see we're talking about similar people. And that's how we created these diagnoses, in order to see what drug would work best for what conglomerations of behaviors. And it all started very optimistically. But at the end, we realized that most of these drugs are not particularly helpful, and that the diagnostic criteria we created have very little to do with actual brain or mind issues. They don't really measure anything in particular. We have no biomarkers for any of these things. So it happened to be a mistake. You make mistakes sometimes in science. It's very important to know. We made a mistake with DSM, and we should have said, sorry, barked at the wrong tree. It's not all about brain chemistry. It doesn't explain it, and drugs are not the answer. But pathetically and sadly, psychiatry became a bunch of drug pushers who lost interest in the mind. And so we don't pay attention to the mind anymore. Even psychologists hardly pay attention to the mind. And so one of the things that I hope TRF and my book and other people will do is to bring the mind back into mental health.
Thank you so much. We got a lot of comments just saying yes and amen to that. So, question 7 is RJ Garcia.
So much. Thank you for being here. What tests can be done to see if our executive functions are mostly offline?
Well, as a clinician, you don't need to do a test because you are a clinician. And you can see if somebody decides to do something, if they actually are able to carry it out. Are people able to make plans and to follow up on it? Are they able to accomplish something? That's how you know whether somebody has executive functioning. You don't need a test. You know, the tests are something you use in order to do research to show that they change. But as a clinician, you know, and actually what you see as a clinician is probably more accurate than any test that you can give people. Right? Still, understanding human behavior is still at the core of what we do, and still our understanding of each other is still at this point bigger than what any test can provide for you. Okay, so executive function is terribly important. And indeed, the goal of good treatment is to get good executive functioning so that you are in charge of what you do and use your energy to actually accomplish what you set out to accomplish. And of course, many of the traumatized people we work with are floundering. They have a hard time mobilizing their energy to actually carry things out and to complete things. That means that something is distracting them and something is preventing them from actually staying focused and concentrated online. And if that's the case, I would say neurofeedback is probably very helpful for a person for that. And again, as a clinician, I don't need a test. But if you want to say neurofeedback is helpful for people with executive functioning problems, as a person like I might do, then I need to have a test. And then what we use for that is an instrument called the Brief or the NIMH toolbox. And so there are some instruments for it that sort of start getting you there, but real life assessment of you went to school, did you pass your exam? You wanted to be a nurse, did you actually do it? Did you stay overnight, or did you get drunk or take drugs instead, or lost track of things? Or that is the test of executive functioning. So really trust your judgment also, and it's very important. I think this whole DSM stuff and the insurance companies sort of running your practice has all made people very poor diagnosticians. And I think it's very important for you and your colleagues to talk very precisely about what do I see? What is really going on with this person? What is working and what isn't working? So we need to bring very careful clinical observations back into our field. And I must say that I think that when I trained, which was about 45 years ago, people were much better diagnosticians than they are today. I'm shocked what a terrible diagnosis come out of health programs right now, because the DSM says, oh, you have the symptoms, oh, I know what's going on with you. No, you don't know what's going on with you. So thank you for that question.
Welcome, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Question 8, Jason Mark Yates.
Yeah, concerning the numbing within, how can we better understand reactions of people around us due to their early childhood abuse? Just as an example, my mother had schizophrenia. Does that add anything? Does that make things more complicated?
It sure does. If as a kid, your mom starts talking crazy and starts doing crazy, that is the center of your world. And you somehow need to deal with that stuff that's going on around you. And as a kid, your natural inclination is to try to help that mom. That's maybe how you became a mental health professional, because you were trained very early by dysfunctional parents to do the best you could to take care of them. And so you're very well trained from very early on to be the wise person in the room. It's not something I would generally advocate for people, because it's not the right time to learn to do that. But that's how many therapists get to be good therapists, because from very early on, they're trained to take care of caregivers who really don't know what they're doing very well. And the other thing is, if the people around you scream and yell and beat each other up, that overwhelms you. And so you learn to block it out. You learn not to feel. And if somebody does something really crazy, you go like, I don't hear this. And you sort of numb yourself out in order to feel these things. So all these things, all these behaviors can be understood as ways of people working as hard as they can to survive. And so having psychotic parents or terrorist parents or violent parents really puts a burden on the kid. So how do they deal with it? And how they deal with it is understandable. Some kids choose that, oh, I know what's going on here. The most violent person in the house gets gets what he wants to have done, maybe if I become very violent also, I'll get stuff also. So you identify with the aggressor. Another kid might say, oh my God, this is too much. I cannot stand this. I'm going to numb myself out and play computer games all the time. So all of these behaviors are adaptations to the environment. And in some ways, I like to keep going back to this point that people, by and large, do the best they can. Or as Dick Schwartz says in IFS, all parts are welcome. All these things develop in order to cope. And at some point, they may become very bad adaptations where people chronically hurt other people, but they started off as ways of protecting yourself and coping with unbearable situations. And I think in order to treat all of that, you need to go back to what were you trying to deal with and what was so unbearable back then. And in that work, actually, our latest research in psychedelics turns out to be extraordinarily helpful, actually. Okay? Does it answer you to some of your satisfaction? I mean, these are very complex questions at the core of what we do, you know?
Yeah. It started in the womb with me, I think, because I was rejected at birth. So it's almost before I could speak, you know. So it's quite complicated, I think. But a lot of what you've said has been very helpful, yeah.
But, you know, so we just finished an MDMA study for MAPS, for the Multiple Disciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And when we started this study, I sort of joined it after it had been designed. I urge people to not have people in the study who never have felt wanted and who had no pre-traumatic history, but their life has always been trauma. Because they said that's not post-traumatic stress disorder when there is no early imprint of never having been traumatized. How can you instill something in people where they actually feel safe and calm? And I didn't think that any of our treatment methods are very good at that. And much to my astonishment, what we found that when people take MDMA, they actually go there and have a dramatic increase in self-compassion, self-understanding, and the capacity to know I belong to be here and I deserve to be here. And that is a very surprising finding for me, and possibly the most important research finding of my entire 50-year career. So, because up to recently, we really had no scientific evidence that you could actually repair some of these imprints, and the way you sit and the way you talk. I can see the burden of what Stephen Cope calls the burden of the unwanted child, which is very common in our society. And how do you repair being an unwanted child? And it turns out that also in our yoga studies, we saw that some of it's repaired when you start having a loving relationship to your body that changes. And then in the psychedelic treatments, we found that the psychedelics really can open you up to a much more global view of yourself as being a member of the universe. And almost inevitably, when people take psychedelics, you get these experiences of, I'm part of the universe. I'm not a big part of the universe, I'm just a small molecule in this overall molecule, but I'm a beautiful little molecule. And so we're seeing transformations that I've never seen before, actually. And that's why this development is such a promising development. Okay? Yeah, this is another question I wanted to answer. We're all doing it. We're challenging it right now by talking to yourself. My book has sold a lot of copies. Hopefully, at some point, that will have an impact somewhere. So we do what we can. But you want to say more about it?
Yeah, I just want to say first, I hope this is not an offense, but I'm finding this conversation so delicious. It is so nourishing to me. I've watched so many YouTube videos, hear you talk, but this is like the full meal. So thank you. I'm like at a Thanksgiving dinner. This is so exciting. But I really, your ideas are so it's such a paradigm shift. And I'm just there's such a general consensus in schools of psychology around trauma and how it works and what we need to do. But your ideas is such a pivot and such a shift. How can we explore this idea and make it stick, because it truly can allow people to heal and recover and thrive versus our general framework that harms people?
Well, one thing I can say is that I found clinicians to be a very docile lot. They are told to slap these stupid DSM diagnoses on their patients. And I hardly ever see a clinician say, I won't do this anymore. This is bullshit. And you guys have to stand up for yourself and say, this is not a system that's helpful for me, and it will not help people. And I think you guys should be more noisy and more rebellious in a way, and say, no, the reality is that this kid is terrified, and as long as you treat him like a bad kid and punish him for his bad behavior, nothing is going to change. And so I think all of us, I'm sort of by nature and by my culture, I'm a Dutchman by origin. We're very annoyingly blunt people oftentimes, but it's really important to just speak the truth. And when you see this sort of stuff, say, no, this is not okay. And to say, no, this kid is terrified. And if you actually work with these kids and treat them with respect and caring, they actually do well. One population that I'm very intrigued by, and we oftentimes have part of our programs, is prison populations. Because when my first job after my residency was to be the last head of a state mental hospital. And at that time, the crazies went to the state mental hospital, and now the crazies are in our political system. I sometimes feel like they've all left the nut house and they're running the country. But we need to be honest about it, and to say, this is not okay, or this is okay. And when you really treat people with respect and kindness, they will come to life, and they will not hurt other people. And if we don't shame people, they will not become violent. And so we need to be very vocal about it. And actually, I think our field is becoming more vocal. And my book is not the only book that is around talking about this stuff. There's a lot of books like this, and I think it's becoming the prevailing paradigm among many mental health professionals, is how you deal with it. And I think that's what we should be doing. And part of that, of course, is life is about politics. And if people say you can only do that treatment, is to really say, yeah, you can only do that treatment because nobody bothered to study other treatments, or nobody got funded for other treatments. And when you find that a particular treatment that you're forced to do doesn't work, to say it doesn't work. And to really be very honest about what is working and what isn't working. But it is a truth-telling type situation. And it's incumbent on all of us to really be very articulate what we see and what we do and what works and what doesn't work. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thank you. The next question is asked by Jenny Willoughby, and part 2 will be asked by Kimberly Cohen.
Hi, Bessel. I am part 1 of this question, but I do believe you addressed this pretty thoroughly when you were talking about shame. So I'm going to adjust it just a little bit to ask if you could just speak to how these feelings of not enoughness and lack of self-worth that are internalized as children of abuse, how those can perhaps lead to a greater risk of re-traumatization and or limit resilience or relational and life success further on.
So of course, it's a huge issue. This is part of how we have become very careless, again, with our diagnoses. And so if you've read my book, you know how hard I fought to not only have PTSD in our diagnostic framework, but also the attachment system. And most people we treat, the primary issue is disorganized attachment, and the trauma is secondary. So, what Carnelize Ruth and other people have shown us is that if you have parents who are too traumatized, too drug addicted, to whatever, to really take care of their kids, that creates a new identity, the identity of I'm not worth loving, and I cannot count on anybody, and I'm all by myself, and I'm God forsaken because nobody's there for you. That is strictly speaking not trauma. That has to do with the violation of our primate nature. And our primate nature is to take care of each other, to be part of a troop, to be part of a family. And that is not the same thing as trauma. And I wish that people would really be more careful about it, because the sense of I'm nobody and I'm not good enough is really a function not of trauma, but a function of not being seen, not being wanted, and not being known. So what is critical, and our whole DSM again gets away from this. I sometimes go to children's center and I'm just astounded how there is very little activity. There's no rhythmical stuff. Kids don't make music, kids do any of the things that the kids who I know all do with their parents and their families. Namely, they do things, they make food together, they eat together, they do things together, because life of us primate is a social life. And if you don't get it, you feel alienated and you don't feel any good. And so how do you make up for that? And that's an important thing to explore. And we don't have the answer for that because these projects don't get funded. So a lot of people have opinions about it, but we don't really know. So, for example, I went to Buenos Aires a bunch of times, and Argentina is a very traumatized country. And then you go to tango dancing performances and you go like, that's how people create tango dancing. When you're traumatized, you're out of sync with people, you're out of tune with people. And of course, they had to invent tango, because in tango, you learn to just move in the right way and you adjust your rhythmical systems to other human beings. What a beautiful treatment for that early attachment disturbance where you don't feel in sync with anybody, but here in tango dancing, you feel in sync with other people. And then you go to Brazil and you see all these kids do capoeira. And then you see what sort of background they have. I say, oh, maybe they don't do capoeira to make the tourists happy. Maybe they do capoeira because it allows their bodies to feel a sense of agency, a sense of power, a sense of calm, and a sense of competency. So all this stuff is based on a core feeling of I'm not competent and I'm not wanted, and hence I'm a worthless human being. And this is a feeling that becomes pervasive. I've treated Nobel Prize winners who still feel like that. There's nothing else you can do after that, after getting the Nobel Prize. And that wasn't good enough. Because that core sense of I wasn't wanted and my mom didn't want me and tried to abort me also stays very deep. And so the question is how you go into that. And that actually is the thing that got me into studying psychedelics, because psychedelics turned out to be extremely helpful for them. Research is still early, still in our infancy, but it's very promising. So how do you get a sense of self-worth? Is by physically feeling your competency, feeling your agency, feeling like I did it. When you deal with little kids, they go all the time, look, I made a drawing. And they go like, wow, what a beautiful drawing. And that's how you get a sense of, hey, my grandpa says that I make a beautiful drawing. That must mean I'm a good person. And if people don't look at your drawings and you never get to do anything, you get a sense of whatever I do is not worthwhile. And so people need to have a physical sense, not just talking about it, therapists yak, but you need to have experiences of, wow, that makes me feel good in my body. That makes me feel I've contributed something. So we need dimensions of doing and dimensions of experiencing. So things like outward bound programs, basic training in the military. Don't think about it as a therapeutic action. people join the military are not the cream of the crop by and large, and they go through very tough exercises. And after 12 weeks of basic training, they go like, wow, I'm amazing. I survived basic training. I'm a Marine. Ugh. So you need to have physical experiences of doing things that make your body feel competent.
The follow-up to that, if I just may ask for another clarification, was, so I know that the feelings of, for myself personally, lack of self-worth or not enoughness led me to be in situations and to seek out validation in situations that were re-traumatizing or that traumatized in a different way. And so do you have any thoughts on that or suggestions on that so that people are successfully finding those alternative methods to establish self-worth and success?
I don't call them alternative methods. I call giving people drugs alternative methods. Human beings are geared to do things and to create things, and they make music and they dance together. That's normal. Popping a pill is not normal. Okay, so let's get our priorities straight here.
Noted.
And of course, if you have been abused, you get the feeling that's all I'm good for. That's very much part of your imprint. I'm just a damaged person. People do whatever with me, and I need love, so I'll do whatever I can do to get love for myself. Happens all the time. It's a very core thing about the consequences of abuse. And many people talk about it in their own lives. Of I just had sex with anybody who came along because I was just desperately looking for love, and that's all I'm good for. And so you need to already begin to have a sense of self-esteem. Like, no, I don't want to do this. This makes me feel dangerous. And how do you get that? I think some of the techniques, it's not psychotherapy that does it best. Maybe having a good karate instructor can help you with that. Having a good dance teacher may help you with that. Having a good yoga instructor can get that sense in your body of this, what this feels like to feel good. And so you need to have an imprint in your core self of this feels good. This makes me feel like I'm powerful and I'm worth it. But that doesn't come from a cognitive part. It comes from a sensory part of, yes, I know what it feels like when I feel in charge.
Thank you. And I'll just pass to Kim really quick for any additional.
Okay, I think you very much covered this. So please don't be angry, powers that be. But with this,
even I'm angry, it's okay, you know.
No, we'll be good. No, so systems, mental health systems and doctors and various things like that. I'm wondering if you could incorporate the community, the impact and the power of community and you've touched on some of the things that you can do, but how important that interpersonal connection is, and maybe even some suggestions for people who are meaningfully engaging with people with trauma to help them with their sense of self-worth as they're trying these alternative or, outside of the system.
Real things. What's interesting about this question is how do we regain our self-worth and find hope when all systems fail us? All systems, you're a mental health professional and you think that all systems are mental health systems.
Yeah.
You are so wrong.
Well, let me clarify too.
I want to say something, I want to rant on this a little bit. So we live in a capitalist society. Most mental health systems are there to make money. And so their primary mission is to make money and not to take care of patients. I see it right now with psychedelics and ketamine, that let's make some more money. So it's not all systems. It happens to be, what system do you work for? And I bet your choral director will not fail you if you apply to sing in a choir. And your tennis instructor may not fail you if you start playing tennis. So mental health professionals are just one segment of our society who deal with a crazy diagnostic system, the DSM, who are being taught to do cognitive behavioral treatment and tell people not to think irrational thoughts. I've tried it many times, never works for me. And so it's not all systems, maybe the system that you work on.
Yeah, I think that question was probably loaded towards the mental health and the medical field. I know for my experience, it isn't as you say, the professionals, it is the layperson, it is the person that goes to lunch or enters someone's space that when they're having a hard time and helps mirror that they are worthy, they have the most significant impact, I would say, by far. So maybe just suggestions for them. And they're probably not going to be speaking self-regulating because they're not immersed in this topic all the time. They're just good people doing good things. But like you said, with the choir director, all of those things that are rhythmic and interactive, those are amazing. Those I'm with you. Those things I think should be primary therapies, not secondary.
Yeah, but you see, I see a lot of messed up mental health systems, but I also see amazing programs wherever I go. I see theater programs, I see yoga programs, I see equine therapy programs, I see outward bound programs, I see singing programs. And so when you really go out of organized medicine, organized mental health, which is all about insurance companies wanting to make money, for profit stuff, and you leave that world behind to the degree that you can, you see generosity everywhere.
I agree.
And in TRF, we are actually always collecting people who do interesting stuff. And if you want to get paid by insurance companies, it's pretty unlikely that you'll actually be able to do that. But there's a very big world out there of very generous people who do very good things.
Thank
So
you.
look for where the people are who do good things.
They're amazing.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. And Naima Mokhtar, you are next up.
Hey. I'm so grateful to be here. Your book, yourself, been instrumental in my recovery. And I just would like to say that I am a NIA teacher, which is at the crossroads of dance, fitness, and martial arts.
Yeah, I know about NIA, yeah.
And all of my clients come to my class after having spent years in therapy on medication, and it never helped them. So it falls into what we've been talking about, dancing, singing, is the way to live a better life. So thank you for providing your views and helping us to validate our work. Because there is this imposter syndrome sometimes, like, oh, I'm not a therapist, I cannot do this work.
I'm just a human being.
Yeah, connection.
I have a question for you. Can you translate this sentence, the question you have, into human language?
My question was, how can therapy be used to help patients find the exiled parts of themselves?
To me, that sounds like a foreign language. I happen to know that foreign language, but can you translate that into English?
Well, from what I understand, this question referred to, I guess, IFS and different...
IFS is another technical term. So imagine that I've never gone to school. What's the question you would ask in very simple terms here?
Please.
So that your delivery guy can understand it too.
Maybe.
Yes, Whitney, you want to share your
try.
Yeah.
Maybe how can therapy be used to help people find acceptance within all of themselves and the different parts of themselves? Would that be more human?
I think we should do better than that. What? Yeah. No, it's very important for us to really know what we're asking, you know?
Yeah.
And if it's not simple, we may miss the boat.
How about this? How about this? Do you know who you are? And if not, how do you find out?
And how do you make peace with that?
So how can therapy help people find themselves?
Find themselves.
Or even where does it hurt inside? Like where do you hurt?
Where do you hurt? Well, that's simple. The therapist, where does it hurt?
Or what would you like to be able to do or have that you feel like you really can't have and have never had?
You know, my impression is that people rarely can articulate what they don't have. You don't know it, you don't know it. So let's keep figuring this out. What's the right question?
Okay.
How can we help people get more in touch with their playfulness and innocence when they feel like they weren't allowed to have that?
Yeah.
So are we talking about the inner child?
But I don't think that's quite what this question says. What are the exiled part of oneself?
Those are the part you hate. Those are the part you hate, don't want. Get rid of it, hide it.
Right.
You need to disavow, right? So can we sort of reframe it? Like, how do you help people to get in touch with unexplained things that they do or feel that are frightening and upsetting? Yeah, is that a fair way of putting it?
The shadow.
Yeah, but again, many people don't know what the shadow means. I really worked very hard in my book to put everything in understandable language. You don't need to have gone to fancy school to know it. And if it gets fancy, I always get a little suspicious of it. Like, I find this a fancy sentence.
Nadia? Nadia, you want to share?
Yes, so honored to be here. What I see in this question is between, EMDR work that we do to understand our minds made survival instinct parts versus our true selves. And so therapy can be used to identify the survival parts that have been created to manage the fact that we've been exiled from our true self because of trauma. So calming, therapy that's calming, where we can get in the body, like with the dance, with breath, with Kundalini yoga, which I teach. And we can then kind of sit in the exiled part to observe all the survival parts. That's how I see this question.
I don't quite see it that way.
Okay.
When we talk about exiles, we talk about parts of ourselves that are that do terrible things to us, that make you feel desperate, that make you feel like you want to kill yourself, or
so that's what I'm speaking
utter
of.
despair. Huh?
I'm speaking of the part that is in the running to stand still, that is the perfectionist, that is the over-sexualized, that is the disassociated. I'm talking about the parts that are so painful, but that's how our brain has been marked to survive because of trauma.
When you think about IFS, the things that you now mentioned here are called managers.
Okay.
And the manager there, so you become a perfectionist in order to never get caught into being that helpless, terrified child. So that's a manager. And so you do all these things in order to not feel that horrible feeling of trauma. And so what IFS does very justifiably so is you map out how you cope with the world. And so you sometimes become very perfectionistic and insist that things get done a particular way, or you become very compliant. And it's very important to lay out what your habitual way is of moving through the world. and then to identify how those particular parts may actually keep you from being happy. You're always upset, you don't think it's right. That's not an exile, that's a manager. And then the question in IFS, you say, what would happen if you stop managing? What happens if you just let your room get dirty, or you don't wash your dishes at night, or you don't tell your partner to do it a particular way, and you stop trying to control everything? And then the question is to discover what you're afraid will happen if you give up these things. And that's what the exiles are. And what are you afraid of in yourself that will happen if I stop doing what I'm doing? And so I think it's very important to put it in language that anybody can understand, because we don't treat other mental health professionals, we treat folks. And so the thing is here that we have habitual ways of doing things, and we have learned that in order to protect ourselves. And so that's really, we need to get an appreciation of, oh, when I feel that I'm stupid, I do the following things so that nobody will find out how dumb I am, or nobody will find out how angry I am, or so you do these things to protect things. And so this is what IFS is very much an exploration of yourself and getting to know who this creature is and how I make my way through the world. And then you discover, and for that you need language, you need to have interoceptive capacities, which is not everybody has, to really observe themselves. And that's a very important part of being a therapist, is to help people to learn to observe themselves. And then you see that all of these things developed in order to protect yourself. And then once you know that you're here to protect myself, you get to know what were you protecting yourself from, and then you go into visiting that very wounded part of yourself, which we call the exile. So how do you get people in touch with the wounded parts of yourself? Is by honoring the protectors. Honoring the parts of you that are overly controlling or overly compliant or whatever you do to manage your life, and say, okay, I do these things because if I didn't do this with my dad or with my mom, I would have been killed. So these were very helpful adaptations. And rather than condemning those parts of yourself, you say, thank you very much for being obsessive compulsive or driving everybody crazy with your controlling behavior. You needed that back then in order to survive. And then after you honor those defenses, you go like, how can we maybe talk these parts into adjusting themselves to today and to see what are they protected? And then once you access that very wounded part of yourself and you develop self-compassion for that helpless, enraged, terrified kid, then you can move on with your life. And so it's really about mapping out an internal sense. But many of us live in systems where you get 8 sessions to cure somebody. You can't do that in 8 sessions. Getting to really know yourself is as complex as the most complex neurosurgery. And you don't say to a neurosurgeon, I'll give you half an hour to fix somebody's brain. And so as clinicians, I would strongly encourage you to actually say to your insurance companies, whoever funds you, no, I cannot do it in 8 sessions. That is a delusion. And they don't really want to be part of a delusional system. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Naima, for asking that question too. I think that question was from one of them from the study guide. So
yes, it wasn't mine. That's why I didn't read it first. But I have one, if I may.
Yeah.
Based according on everything what's been said so far, is the West trying to answer a question that shamanic culture or the East already answered 1,000 years ago?
I wouldn't dare to say that. I don't know enough about satanic rituals, shamanic rituals, to know if they have done that. I've traveled a lot to very other parts of the world, and I'm not really somebody who would romanticize non-Western cultures. They have certainly, many of them do things that we could learn something from, but most cultures are not all that great. I'm still looking for the culture where people don't kill each other and don't beat each other up. I haven't found them yet.
I am referring to the use of psychotropes and the use of bodywork as yoga and preventive medicine such as Ayurveda.
Yes, so, it's very possible. I know a lot of people who do ayahuasca ceremonies, and who most people I know who have done that say that it was a profound transformative experience. Some people say, I'll never do it again because this is horrible. I've really got damaged by it. So they certainly knew stuff we don't know. Maybe we know some stuff they don't know. I don't know.
Thank you.
They don't romanticize other cultures. Yeah. I think we can learn from them. But
thank you. The next question is by Hanai.
Hello, my name is Hania, but that's okay.
Hania, sorry.
All good. I want to admit that I struggle today with being very present with all of us. As I am from Poland and a lot of my family, friends and clients are in Ukraine. So on the side, I'm also checking on them, to be honest.
And we should. So I honor that. It's a very big issue. And I'm actually surprised that any of us can talk today, because something terrible is happening in the world. Europe has been in peace since 1945, basically, except for Yugoslavia. And today something is happening that is horrifying and will change history. And everything we say today is minor compared to what's happening in the Ukraine today, which is horrifying.
Thank you for honoring that. And following up on that, I would try to connect my question with what's happening. As the question connects me with my experience of working with refugees from Syria and Afghanistan, who, to secure their safety, as I believe Ukrainians will have to secure their safety, and they had to tell their stories. And as you know, they are based on our memories that very often are fragmented. What happens in the court and migration offices is, of course, dissociation, very loss of memory, loss of ability to speak. So here is the question that relates to it. In what ways might we increase society's knowledge about memory, dissociation, amnesia, and reenactments as well?
Yeah, this is one of the questions I ask people not to ask, because it's like we do what we can. I write my books and I publish my articles, and you do what you're doing. We do what we can. So I don't know what else we can say about it. Like, be honest, speak up for yourself, write books, hope for the best.
That sounds like an easy solution. However, it doesn't really reach the, like a big crowd that is then sitting in the courts.
See, but it's not a big crowd. The people I really admire are my friends who have yoga programs in the prisons. The people who I know who perform Shakespeare in a particular school. The people who run martial arts programs with juvenile offenders. God is in the details, and our work is in the details. And every time you treat a traumatized person well, you do your job. Your job is not to change the world. We are 1 out of 8 billion people. And let's not get very grandiose, but if you're in good condition, just take care of the people who you're supposed to take care of, and you'll do enough.
Thank you. Then I will come back to my Ukrainian clients and give the microphone to the next person.
Thank you. And our next question is by Holly Elisa Bruno.
Boy, I selected some questions and I threw some of them out. This is also not a question that I threw out, but okay. I'm sorry that my suggestions were.
Not sure what happened there.
Okay.
Hi. Well, hey, I'm Holly Elisa, and I'm a survivor. And if this is a question you threw out, I can live with that. I've got another question, which I can cut to the chase with. But let me just say,
Why don't you do that?
Yeah, I shall.
Yeah.
And I want to say thank you so much for everyone for honoring the Ukraine. How can those of us who are trauma survivors not have great empathy and pain with what is going on?
Terror.
Really.
Yeah,
So
terror. People are getting bombed, you know. It's terrible what's happening, huh?
Yes. And so thank you. We could perhaps all just take a moment to honor them all. And also I'll get my brain back in order.
Yeah.
Look, I'm going to just cut to the chase. Judith Herman wrote in Trauma and Recovery years ago. She said, look, children who are traumatized, our brains develop more rapidly in some ways, that they develop differently than children who are allegedly the average child. Honey, I don't know one average child, to tell you the truth. But here's my question. I see so many trauma survivors who are doing great things on earth. I mean, thank you for writing your book. Thank you for everybody who's working in the prisons. Thank you for people who are working with small children, with refugees. Thank you. And so what I heard you say before was, look, people really adapt and we find ways. But here's what I want to know. Are there developmental things happening with little children that actually can be productive, that are traumatized? I mean, I have memories. I'm going to tell you the truth. I have memories of being a traumatized child with a psychotic mother and a narcissistic father who was incestuous with me. And I recall moments of clarity saying, I need to survive this. And I'm a happy kid. Where do I find happiness? And so I walked out the door to nature and I befriended all kinds of other people. I'm aware that there are other people that also need to ask questions, but I just want to say to you, ask you.
Your questions, good. You're talking to the heart and talking from experience.
Yes.
Yeah, you speak an understandable human language, so that's great. Yeah.
So what I want to know is it true that there are ways in which we develop as traumatized children that can actually be useful? I mean, here's an example. I have always had a sense of humor, and I'm in a humorless family. Yeah. Where did I get that? So yeah, can you help us with that?
How do we elicit a sense of humor in people? I find now, if you'd ask me what do you rate as the most important things to have in order to recover from trauma, I would put a sense of humor somewhere near the top. How do you get a sense of humor? I don't know. You'd say, oh, it has to do with playfulness and spontaneity, but a lot of very traumatized people I know have a morbid and quite marvelous sense of humor that has allowed them to be skeptical and to be ironic and to say, isn't it crazy? And then have two realities at the same time. So humor is a mark of great intelligence because humor is all about comparing two different realities. If you get too deep in your trauma, you don't have your sense of humor anymore because you just have a horrific reality and not an alternative viewpoint there. The reason why I kicked out this particular question is something I already have hinted at, is I think the brain science is wonderful. And the fact that we can see what happens in people's brains is marvelous. But the complexity of the human mind goes way beyond what we can measure in brain scanners. And so I was part of the team that did the first brain scans in PTSD. And what do? You put people on a stretcher, you tie them down, you put a vice around their head so they can move, and you put them in this fearsome machine. It's actually, I call it a pre-traumatic condition, to be shoved into a big machine and be immobilized. It's completely unnatural to be immobilized. Even as I talk to you, I'm still moving my hands. You're listening to me, you're nodding, moving your face. We're mobile people. And so brain scanning is interesting, but it won't give us the ultimate answers about human resiliency and human creativity, because you probably cannot measure human creativity with brain scans. But it's very easy to measure human creativity by seeing what they do. So you don't need to have this fancy technology. I love the fancy technology because, that opens up some new perspectives. But for God's sake, don't lose human observations and the mind and relationships, because that's really who we fundamentally are. And when you lie in scanner, you're not related to anybody because you're lying in this damn machine and you don't really feel connected with people. So no, the brain doesn't tell us very much about us. When you come to my conference, we always have the latest technology, but you also have what it's like to play with kids and to move with kids and do theater with kids. And indeed, you are a good example, and many other people I know. I like to think that the great advances in mankind have been made by trauma survivors. Because if you come from a perfectly normal family, of which I have not met too many, you'll grow up and say, the world is just fine the way it is. And you have no urgency to do anything new. But if you come from pain and horror, you have to create something new. One of my great examples is Isaac Newton, the inventor of mathematics and physics, an absolute genius. When you read about his childhood, you go like, how come this kid didn't kill himself? This was just the most horrendous childhood. And so he escaped into mathematics in order to not feel all that pain. Some people escape into music to not feel all that pain. Other people escape into painting to not feel. Other people become great writers. These are all ways in which you try to organize, desperately try to organize all the pain that you feel inside. And oftentimes beautiful and amazing and powerful things come out of that, created by trauma survivors as their way of surviving. And
I want to jump in because I have a colleague who works for the school system,
yeah.
and he has got a really important question he's been dying to ask about children in schools. So thank you so much. I'd go on and on, but let's go to him.
Wait.
Ed, would you like to ask your question now?
Oh, this was one of my questions I really wanted to have.
Yeah. And let me just mention, Bessel, we're at 5:30, but if you have the flexibility, I think we have 2 more questions from our panelists.
We can do that, yeah, it's fine with me.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, these are the questions I had put high on the list of questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Brendan, maybe I see Nadia's question. Can you flip to Ed's?
Nadia, we'll get to you next.
Do the first one first, because the one before, they're here. This is a very important question.
Oh, Nadia's, okay. And then we can go to.
I'd selected that first question as the first question to be asked, because I think that's such an important question, because we see that all the time of kids who are not safe at home. And what do we do for them? Kids' natural protective systems are their parents. And if your parents don't see you or don't notice you, have no language for them, you become a blob of feelings. But if you have somebody who cares for you, that person can help you to talk and to observe and to create some distance between what goes on and who you are. So the natural thing when you are terrified is to cling to whoever you can find to cling to. So if you're being abused, you cling to your abuser. Non-traumatized kids are always out playing and doing things, being with their friends, because their parents are basically quite uninteresting people. And they become curious. But you're a frightened kid, you try to desperately cling to somebody, whoever you can find, to not feel completely bereft. And so then outside people can do amazing things for these kids by knowing them, seeing them, and helping to find words. And to say, my dad becomes very angry and upset when he gets drunk. And when you can say that, you can start beginning to get a sense of, that's not because I'm a bad person, that's because my father has a problem with alcoholism. So a kid needs to come to the conclusion that their observations are accurate, and that they actually can understand what's going on. And that's why outside people come in And you may not change the situation, but you can change your interpretation of the situation. So if somebody beats you up, you can actually say to somebody, I'm so scared because I get beaten up at home. And then to talk about what is going on with the other person that makes them do that. And so, and then you can maybe organize yourself a little bit to get out of the way so that you don't get hit. Or you can go to a neighbor's house or you get hit. But as long as you don't have language for it, and you don't have a perception, an organization of what's going on, you're just a ball of fear and a ball of rage. And so all of us, every one of us, can be very powerful in helping kids to find language and to say, this is what it feels like, and that's what happens to me, and this is my reaction, and this is what I can do. So acknowledging the reality of the situation is important. For many people, life is very rough, but as long as you can define what's going on and define what your position will be, you have much more control over it, and you don't make the mistake of getting blood out of a stone and trying to get caring out of a person who is too drunk and too traumatized to do it. To say, my dad cannot care for me because he's too drunk and too traumatized. That's a very important conclusion to draw. Many of my adult patients who are 45, 50 years old are still trying to get blood out of a stone because they still try to fulfill their childlike fantasies. And the sooner you realize, no, I'm sorry, my parents are too impaired to give it to me, the earlier you start looking around for where else can I get what I need. Very important. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because even though the situation may be horrendous, like right now in Ukraine, it's horrendous. But being able to talk about what you need, being able to know what's going on, to be validated, to be known, is always terribly important. And then if you can also teach kids that maybe if you do yoga, or if you breathe in a particular way, or if you tap, you can calm yourself down and you will not get hijacked into an overwhelmed brain, but you can observe. You can say, oh, my dad is at it again. He's probably going to hit me. It's going to hurt. But that's because he is impaired and not me. So you can make a very big difference there. And don't underestimate that. So that is, to my mind, that is really the most important question of the whole day, actually, is because so many kids are living in terrible situations, and can we help them? Yes, we can still help them. To be known, to be seen, and to really have people say, you are a special kid, and I'm sorry that your dad is out of control, your mom is out of control, but I believe in you. It's an incredibly powerful thing. So then the last thing is, it's a very big topic. It's the middle of my current research. Actually, it's people ask me regularly, so what have you learned since you wrote this book? The one thing I've learned is I run a psychedelic laboratory, so I've learned a lot about psychedelics. What psychedelics do, as I have mentioned before, it allows you to encounter a different reality. And when you're traumatized, you live in a terrifying internal world. And you're always on the defensive, you're always cautious because you think terrible things could happen to you. And your mind tends to get very narrowly focused on danger. And what the psychedelic agents seem to do, it opens up your mind and you get to see that the world is a much larger world than the world that has been defined for you by the environment that you live in. And you get to see that the world is much bigger and your perceptions can be much bigger. And what MDMA, I don't know about the other substances because MDMA is the only substance I'm studying, like really seriously studying. And that MDMA allows people to develop a sense of self-compassion and a sense of, this is what happened to me, it was terrible, but I didn't deserve this. I needed care, and I'm going to give myself the care that I need. I'm just about finished with the basic data for our study, but I think what we're about to publish is really quite stunning. And probably the most important thing I've done in my entire career is that these agents can make it possible for you to meet yourself with love and compassion. and to understand who this creature is that you are. But so the critical thing that is very important here, what you need to do is you need ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. You need to do MDMA-assisted psychotherapy so you can use these substances to not just have an experience, but to really process information, to get a perspective. So psychotherapy is a very important part of the whole thing, so that you can integrate these experiences that you have had while on psychedelics and to see how they're relevant to your life. I am very worried that with ketamine, which is legal, that right now there's all these outfits that send people ketamine in the mail and say, just take this substance. I think that's crazy. And these are mind-altering substances that blow your mind. Don't blow your mind by yourself, because terrible things may come up. So it needs to be done under very caring, thoughtful circumstances. I'm delighted that Big Dublin and MAPS and the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies is absolutely insistent on only administering these drugs under very carefully controlled conditions. In some ways, the shamans do that in their own way. They also have a very clear ritual in which you practice these things. And so this is not stuff you take in the evening after you watch TV when nobody is around and stuff like that. It needs to be done very carefully. And these are, as a scientist, I don't really like to use these terms in public, but these are sacred substances. And going through a psychedelic experience is a sacred experience. So you need to really prepare yourself for it and take it very seriously. But they have great potential.
It's exciting. Thank you. And the last question is by Dr. Edward Mooney.
Hi, Bessel. Good to see you.
Hi.
I grew up an abused teen. I taught abused teenagers through many years at high school. And I'm studying the interaction of traumatized teachers with students living with trauma. And I know relationships are critical to learning. How could two traumatized people, a teacher like myself and a student, who I was, overcome this barrier?
Well, as often happens, the person who asked the question probably knows more about the subject than the person who is being asked. So I really would like to turn this question back on you, because you have studied it, you have really paid attention to it, and I really would like to say, so what's your experience? Because undoubtedly you know more than I do about this subject.
You're very kind. A couple things I noticed is, number one, a lot of administrators did not want me telling students that I had been physically abused as a teen. They actually tried to stop it. But I found that my openness to say, here's what I went through, not in graphic details, as a child, brought kids closer to me in the long run, I believe. By the way, a lot of them over 30 years later, we're still friends. I like what you say. I am still, I believe this is a lifelong relationship. I think our healing is a lifelong process.
Yeah.
So I am still in contact with those students. And it is amazing to me, now that they're adults, they are now sharing with me details of what happened when they were kids.
Yeah.
So I would say that if I were to answer the question, is number one, be a human being. We forget as teachers, one of our primary duties is to teach young people how to be adults. And that includes the emotional realm. And number two is, don't be afraid to be vulnerable, even though it is difficult for those of us who were abused to be vulnerable. Anyway, does that answer make sense?
I think I'm so with you that I actually know some people who teach in schools, and I get a close look at it. And some people who have been abused are extraordinary teachers. The ones who are in touch with their own hurt as a kid, really understand when a kid is hurt and have compassion for them and know what they need, because they know what they needed themselves back then, and they are exceptional teachers. And then there's the people next door who also probably have been abused, but who disavow their own abuse, and they were desperately trying to pretend like they're normal, even though they have all kinds of flaws like most of us, and who say, you need to do it this way. So they rigidly try to defend themselves against their own traumatic memories and punish their kids as much as they punish themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And you see that also. And what I find in school programs, so I've been involved in theater programs in schools and yoga programs in schools, you can only do it if the teachers buy in.
Yes.
If the teachers say, I was hurt too as a kid, and I was humiliated too as a kid, because all of us are at some point or another. And to say, it really hurt me when people put me down. And this teacher who actually knew my name and picked me out and sat down with me, that person helped me. Or like my third grade teacher was a former soldier, an Indonesian guy who had fought on the side of the Dutch in the colonial wars. And he talked about his experience of being a soldier. I'll never forget that guy. And he really, I think he maybe installed a deep sense in me about how horrible it is to be a soldier and to see people getting killed. And as a 9-year-old kid, I really took that in and said, oh, what an amazing guy. He's gone through all this and he can talk about his pain and his hurt and his guilt. And that's what he taught me. He didn't just teach me reading, writing, and arithmetic. He taught me about life.
Mm-hmm. I have noticed that teachers who are out of connection with their own trauma and teachers who are in connection, there's great amount of conflict there, because I think we remind them that they're ignoring something that they may need to go back and look at.
And that's true for teachers and mental health professionals and physicians, just across the board. Do you own your stuff or don't you own your stuff? Huh?
Amen.
I'm so glad I turned the question around because you gave the right answers. That's great.
Oh, thank you, sir. I appreciate your time.
Okay. That's it. Laura, are you going to close it out? Are you?
Teresa, I think Teresa's going to close.
Yeah.
Yep.
So thank you all, everyone, for being here with us together for our first book club. Thank you, Dr. Bessel Vanderholk, for spending this time with us and sharing such valuable research, knowledge, and your work in the field of trauma. And thank you all to the panelists for being with us these last weeks and all of you for following along. And of course, a big thank you to the entire TRF team that makes this entire production possible. We have 2 invitations to share with you before we say goodbye. The first, of course, is to invite you again to join us at the 33rd International Trauma Conference that's happening both in person and online this year from May 18th to the 21st. Early bird tickets are available until April 19th. And you can find the full conference schedule on our website. And the second invitation is to welcome you back for our second book club that's going to be starting on April 14th. The next book we'll be reading together is No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. And that one you'll find will have 4 sessions for this book club. The first 3 sessions will align with each section of the book, and the 4th session will feature a similar Q&A like we did today with Richard Schwartz. And you can begin registering for that book club starting on Monday through our website. So thank you all again for being here. Please take good care. Go do some karate, dance, breath, and movement, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Teresa. Wonderful.
Thank you, Bessel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think they wanted us to stick around for a little bit.